What happened to the P-51 Mustang after WWII? When the war ended, the P-51 Mustang did not suddenly vanish into silence. It lingered on airfields across Europe, Asia, and the United States, resting in long rows beneath open skies that were no longer threatened by enemy bombers. For many of the pilots and ground crews who had lived with the aircraft through years of urgency and loss, the Mustang felt almost alive, as if it too needed time to understand that the war was over. During the final months of World War II, the P-51 had reached a kind of mechanical maturity. Its long-range escort capability had helped break the back of the Luftwaffe, and its reputation was firmly set as one of the finest piston engine fighters ever built. But peace changes priorities. Within weeks of victory, the U.S. military began shrinking at a pace nearly as dramatic as its wartime expansion. Thousands of aircraft were suddenly surplus, including Mustangs that had only recently left the factory. Many P-51s were flown back to the United States and parked in massive storage depots in places like Arizona and California. There, in dry desert air, they were carefully preserved with the possibility that they might be needed again. Mechanics drained fluids, sealed openings, and wrapped components, treating the aircraft not as relics, but as assets waiting for their next assignment. At the same time, others were simply sold off. The government offered Mustangs to civilians at prices that would later seem unbelievable, sometimes for only a few $1,000s. Yet the Mustang's military story did not end in 1945. As jet aircraft began to appear, they were fast but unreliable and short-range. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the U.S. Air Force, still needed a dependable fighter. The P-51, redesigned and redesignated as the F-51, remained in service. It patrolled occupied territories, flew air defense missions, and continued training duties well into the late 1940s. Then came Korea. When war broke out in 1950, jets like the F-80 Shooting Star struggled with the realities of rough airstrips and limited endurance. The old Mustang was pulled from storage, refitted, and sent back into combat. Over the hills and valleys of Korea it flew ground, attacked missions, striking supply lines and troop positions. The role was dangerous and punishing, very different from high-altitude escort work over Europe. Many Mustangs were lost to ground fire, and pilots faced constant risk. But the aircraft once again proved its toughness and adaptability. As jet technology improved, the Mustang's days in frontline military service finally drew to a close. By the mid-1950s, most were retired from active duty. Some were transferred to Allied air forces around the world. Countries in Europe, Asia, and Latin America flew P-51s for years afterward, sometimes into the 1960s, using them for air defense, training, and even counterinsurgency operations. In these distant skies, the Mustang became a familiar sight long after it had disappeared from American bases. In civilian life, the aircraft found an entirely new identity. Former military pilots and aviation enthusiasts bought surplus Mustangs and transformed them into racing machines. At air races, especially in places like Reno, the P-51 became a symbol of speed and raw power. Modified engines, clipped wings, and polished fuselages pushed the aircraft far beyond its wartime performance, turning it into a living experiment in aerodynamics and engineering. Others were restored not for speed, but for memory. Museums acquired Mustangs and returned them to their original markings, carefully recreating squadron colors and nose art. Each aircraft became a quiet storyteller, carrying the names of pilots, the scars of combat, and the weight of history. When restored Mustangs took to the air at airshows, their sound alone was enough to stop conversations, a deep, smooth roar that seemed to come from another era. Over time, the P-51 Mustang became more than a fighter plane. It became a bridge between generations, a reminder of a moment when engineering, necessity, and human courage aligned. Long after World War II ended, the Mustang continued to fly, not because it had to, but because people refused to let it fade away. In the calm sky of peacetime, it carried with it echoes of urgency, endurance, and a chapter of history that still refuses to be forgotten. As the decades passed, the surviving Mustangs slowly spread across the world, each one beginning a quiet second life shaped by the people who owned it. Some sat forgotten in hangars, covered in dust, their logbooks incomplete, their stories paused rather than finished. Others were taken apart piece by piece, restored with patience that bordered on devotion. A single aircraft might take years to return to flight, as mechanics searched for original parts or painstakingly recreated components that no longer existed anywhere else. The Mustang's aluminum skin aged differently depending on where it lived. In dry climates, the metal held its shape and strength, while in humid regions corrosion crept in softly, almost invisibly. Each aircraft became a reflection of its environment and its caretakers. Some bore fresh paint and immaculate markings, while others wore faded insignia, allowing time to leave its mark openly. Neither felt wrong. Both felt honest. Pilots who flew the Mustang after the war often spoke of it differently than those who had flown it in combat. Without the pressure of survival, the aircraft revealed a gentler personality. It was responsive, balanced, and forgiving in experienced hands. The long nose that once symbolized dominance in the skies now simply pointed forward, steady and confident, as if content to fly without purpose beyond the joy of flight itself. Airshows became places where the Mustang truly lived again. When one taxied onto the runway, spectators often grew quiet without realizing it. The sound of the Merlin engine was not sharp or aggressive, but deep and continuous, like a long, held breath. As the aircraft lifted off, it carried with it not just speed, but memory. For some in the crowd, it was the sound of youth. For others, it was the sound of stories they had only heard, passed down through family or history books. In racing form, the Mustang changed again. Engineers pushed it beyond its original limits, squeezing more power from engines never designed to give it. These aircraft flew lower, faster, closer to the edge of control. The graceful lines remained, but the intent was different. Speed replaced survival. Competition replaced conflict. Even so, the aircraft seemed to accept this transformation without resistance, as though it understood that movement in any form was better than stillness. Not all Mustangs were saved. Many were scrapped in the years after the war, their metal melted down and reused, their identities erased. This loss went largely unnoticed at the time. No one imagined that decades later, a single surviving P-51 would be worth millions, or that people would travel across continents just to stand near one. The value of the Mustang did not rise quickly. It grew slowly, shaped by distance from war and closeness to history. By the late 20th century, the P-51 had settled into a unique place. It was no longer a weapon, and it was no longer modern, but it was never obsolete. It existed in a space reserved for machines that exceed their original purpose. Historians studied it, engineers admired it, artists painted it, filmmakers used it as a visual shorthand for an entire era of aviation. Each time a Mustang flew, it subtly altered the present by reminding people of the past. It showed how quickly technology could advance and how just as quickly it could be set aside. It also showed that some designs endure not because they are perfect, but because they are balanced, thoughtful, and deeply human in their creation. In quiet hangars late at night, restorers sometimes spoke of the aircraft as if it could hear them. They knew the truth, of course, but the feeling persisted. The Mustang had carried people through fear, hope, victory, and loss. It had crossed oceans, survived wars, and outlived the world that created it. In doing so, it earned a kind of presence that could not be measured in speed or range. Long after World War II faded further into history, the P-51 Mustang remained, not frozen in time, but moving gently through it, flight by flight, story by story, continuing on without urgency, without conclusion, simply existing in the open air, exactly where it seemed to belong.